I would like to say to my colleagues and the participants that I couldn't attend yesterday because I was in Tunisia giving a talk, and so this is the rest of the talk, or what I should maybe have said there. So there we go. How do we write the history of an uprising that was interrupted for decades, centuries, and perhaps even millennia? And what happens to us when it resumes elsewhere differently? And would we be even able to notice its return or rebirth? How can we write the history of a movement that, after the victories of independence, perpetuates itself in a diasporic manner in the heart of an imperial or imperial metropole? I say in a diasporic manner, I could, or maybe I should say as Maghreb, since this word, now used to designate North Africa as a so-called region, comes, as Abdelkebir Khatibi tells us, from the Arabic gharib, meaning both a locus, the West, but also the condition of being strange or a stranger. Precisely because we will not find the large crowd of lost testimonies or traces to talk about such movements, we have no choice but to revolutionize the way we do and tell history, or to embrace the singularity of the insurrectional movement so that the way we shape the time of the insurrections themselves is transformed by it. Will our usual storytelling practices themselves resist this? Nothing is less certain. It is necessary in this way to revolutionize the history we write, as our ancestors revolutionized history as a circle of events. Throughout this contribution today, I want to try and draw some of the lineaments of a kind of insurrectional philosophy that would lie beyond or below history, of a discourse that would allow us to take seriously the singular and irreducible temporality of liberation movements, or what we call sometimes decolonization. How do these uprisings overturned and still overturn our idea of freedom, revolution, but of course also of democracy? What is the demos at stake within these histories of interruptions we call liberation movements? Is there even a demos, or should we call it otherwise? Is it the same as the demos of not so liberal democracies, which as nation states are sustained by what I've called somewhere else colonial imperiality, a name for the traces of the Roman Christian God in the failed but ongoing claims of absolute power on earth that destroy this earth? One of the examples of that, of course, is the fact that the president of the French Republic was Napoleon III, and he launched a successful coup d'etat against the Second Republic with the popular consent, which of course makes it a military plebiscite, which of course is this repetition that Marx talks about as, you know, a repetition as comedy or farce. So what I'm trying to talk about is what resists this kind of imperial sovereignty, not reducible to colonialism, but nevertheless inseparable from it. So I have a few hypotheses which will guide us, I hope, in what follow. One, the Greek demos, or the Greek concept of demos, is not only reducible or translatable into shab, which is the Arabic word which oftentimes refers to people, or even to al-watan, which now refers to the nation. Halaqa can be seen as the name for what we are used to call, quote unquote, radical democracy. As a form of political organization, it can be best approached through the multi-layered concept of halaqa, which means the circle, but also the circle of gathering. We are a halaqa, right? Democracy is not a political regime, and it exceeds the classical classification precisely. And strictly speaking, not so liberal democracies can be seen as hybrids of monarchy, aristocracy, and oligarchy, and perhaps even, one might say, theocracy. So what I'm looking for is this other democracy, or the other people, that does not exist only for that very reason, but that is all the more real by virtue of the insistence of its question. So the democracy, or the idea of halaqa I'm trying to sketch today, is that of anti-colonial liberation, or a subterranean tradition of democracy that the wretched of the earth has expressed in the language of Hegelian Marxism and psychoanalysis without ever exhausting it. which means, of course, that the wretched of the earth was the collective expression of the Algerian Revolution, but also of its cosmopolitan or planetary resonances. For do we have the slightest idea of what decolonization has created? We know what these movements refused. We know that many revolutionaries died or suffered, and we're all too familiar. This is perhaps why it's buried in the memories of these underground labyrinths of our minds. We're all too familiar with the crimes and fratricidal crimes that fill the histories of these ancient heroes of our contemporary age. In a word, we know that these movements fought against oppression, slavery, racism, colonialism, and in short, against empires. But liberation is and has always been a gesture of creation, as evidenced by something I want to talk about today, the fragmentary and scattered traces of a theater collective created by the Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, the Arab worker movement in France, 1970s. They created two theater collectives which were also political collectives. The first one was called Al-Asifa, or the Tempest, or the Storm, and the second one precisely was called Al-Halaqa, so the Circle. I want to mention two movies, if you will, by Moroccan artist Bouchra Khalili. So this is taken from one of the films, which are precisely based on these fragmentary traces of what appears to be a non-archivable set of events. The first film is called The Tempest Society, from 2017. The second one is called precisely The Circle, 2023. Khalili animates these traces of the unarchivable, and she sets them in motion and quite simply brings them into life. But more than a simple reference to the MTA, or le Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, the Tempest Society is like the differential repetition of their first troop, precisely the Circle, being circled or returns fragmentally in the other one. It is this gesture of creation which is so absent from some of the strictly political definitions of decolonization, that these two works pay homage, if you will, and celebrate. And far from being mere archives, they bear witness to the deceased, forgotten, in the urgency of the present, reminding us that a dense network of fragmented events lies beneath the new in the underground galleries of oblivion. However, and this is one of the things that she discovers and unearths, if you will, the Arab labor movement was not strictly political. It was also a cultural gesture, or more precisely, a politics of the education of sensibilities, of ways of acting, being, and feeling. The division between, of course, ethics and aesthetics was just as ineffective in this respect as the division between ethics and politics. The new regime, and when we talk about a new regime, we also mean a new political regime that is irreducible to democracy as it appears in this classical classification between different political regimes, is precisely or refers to an aesthetico-political. Of course, you could jump to the partage du sensible, but the point is that the kind of practice that emerged in these diasporic communities during the 70s were the experimentation of that concept before it was even enunciatable or formulable by quote-unquote French theory. Anti-colonialism was an artistic movement. Let's put it in another way. It wasn't so much that art was political, as Mai 68 had said. It was that the members of the MTA, or the Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, caused the divisions between art and politics to simply implode, and with them our ability to recognize one or the other in familiar figures. These are forms of lies that have been invented. They are not the archives of a simple opposition to racism, even though this movement I'm talking about is the very foundation of the first protests against police violence in France. As if this anti-colonial movement owed its existence to the colonialism it was fighting, because it was, of course, necessary to create in order to be able to say no. Al-Asifa, one of their troops or their groups, means, as I said, the storm or the tempest. Of course, we can note the unusual reference to a quote-unquote natural event, because, of course, the wind intensifying blows away whatever is not firmly anchored in the ground. But this storm referred to the gathered crowd, a Halaqa, where everyone is both an artist and a citizen. Public speaking is generalized through theater, creating a space between fiction and reality, a kind of interworld or liminality to better act precisely on the political realm. It refers to the tradition of what is sometimes called the barzakh, that is to say precisely an ism or a liminal realm between what's supposed to be imaginary and real. So residents take part in the circles and the storm. One example is that after the murder of someone called Mohamed, who was shot by the police, his sister came precisely to speak as part of one of the performances of Al-Hasifa. This by no means means that this was a purely migrant art form, or even marginal for that matter. Rather, it is via the immigrants, the organized movements of the Arab workers, that a revolution, literally, if you will, the French society was possible, because this was one of the first movements in which the very idea of unifying French workers with Arab workers emerged, and they emerged in these circles. In 1974, Tunisian migrant worker Jalali Kamel ran for president as a candidate representing all those who cannot vote anywhere in Europe. He was therefore, and presented himself as the citizen of all non-citizens, citizen for that very reason, precisely because he was able to reinvent the very conditions of citizenship. In other words, Kamel operated at the end of democracy, which means at its edge, at its limit, in the zone of annihilation or in the zone of its liminality. He claims that all people who cannot vote in Europe, not only migrants, form a community that is a people, and that they constitute the state of the stateless or the citizenship of the non-citizens. I don't think that his gesture refers to, or rather, I don't think that Kamel is or acts as a colonial or post-colonial subject within the Republic. He does exactly the opposite, that is to say, he becomes and creates the conditions of this becoming a citizen beyond nations. Whereas, of course, a subject would mean that he would remain a non-citizen national subject, or what the French Empire used to call an indigène. So he's not an indigène de la République. He's the exact contrary. The cosmopolitics of democracy exists beyond, despite, and to some extent, against liberal democratic regimes for that reason. This political representative to the presidency was also a performing artist, not a strategist. And he was chosen, he didn't present himself to be elected, he was chosen by the circle precisely, and primarily because he was a storyteller who could bear witness and convince and literally raise awareness for that reason. Actually, what was going on in these circles was to create a space, and that was one of their keywords. And the circle and the storm were both some of these circles. It means that these circles, or the halaqas, were not only circles of gatherings, but circles of listening, in which something was not only conceived but practiced, the following thing, that is that there is no free speech without being heard. So the right to be heard was precisely practiced because this right involved the power to be heard depending on and upon the reality of that circle itself. This is the model of the halaqa from which we might learn today, speaking also for those who cannot speak, but also making them heard and making them understand, making people who do not belong to the circle understanding. So a circle of listening, of course, but also a circle of learning that reminds us that there might be no democracy without practices of knowledge that are both collective and individual. We have to remind ourselves that if the circle is the first model of the community and the collective that migrant workers managed to create through these performances, it's also because Al-Halaqa refers beyond its Islamic matrix, where it literally means a circle of learning. It refers also to the circle formed by those who gather around the storyteller precisely, which refers to an ancestral practice in North Africa. The circle is therefore that of listeners who surround the storyteller, and I want to say here that the circle does not only refer to a model of how space is organized, but also to a certain way in which time is being conceived. And this is what I would like to talk about now, if I have a few minutes. Do I have a few minutes? How much? 5? Good. So I want to go back to one of the films that I was mentioning, which is called The Tempest Society, which ends on a very interesting suggestion, which is to design a constellation of event which is called equality. Constellation is literal, that is to say, it's drawn as a constellation. I propose to consider, following Bushra Khalili, this constellation as a model for the spatialization of the temporality of liberation struggles. Those that were thought to be dead always return, and they talk to each other and enlighten each other in a solar system where the sun never sets. There is no longer a West. All that remains are multiple disoriented Orients, aimless dawns, wandering lights with no Occident to go to as the place where they disappear into the dusks, precisely, of darkness. This is what Khatibi, I think, means when he explored, as I said in the very beginning of my talk, the Maghreb as a horizon of thought, because by referring to Gharib as one of its etymologies, he wanted to talk about the condition of a generalized disorientation. But there is another classic of North African literature and artistic practices, but it's not just this, it's also just North African thought, which is very simply the figure of the circle in Kateb Yassin's work, right? Actually, the entire series of books that he wrote, at least the one he wrote in French, and then afterwards he stopped actually during the 70s writing in French for obvious political reasons. One of the first theater piece precisely that he wrote was called Le Cadavre Encerclé, so the encircled corpse. So it's someone who's dead, it's called L'Arda, and the entire scene is about how a certain kind of circle, a halaqa, is being configured around his corpse, but a corpse that is never actually dead. And the circle, the halaqa, of course, is the stage in which the figure of a woman appears, which is called Nejma, which means the star, which will become the title of his novel that is strictly and intimately connected with this theater piece called precisely Nejma. There is another book afterwards, but we're going to stay here. That is to say, the interaction, intertwinement, interdependence between both these figures, that is to say, the circle and the star. Because precisely, if we go back to what I was trying to say, this is a model to think, of course, of differential repetition, and of course, to spatialize the time of the narrative in ways that precisely allow him to destroy or self-dissolve the very forms he's using, the novel, the theater piece, the poems, and so on and so forth. To go back to Khalili's work, whose work I consider as an entry point into some of the the most difficult questions raised precisely by the analysis of this literary and philosophical tradition I'm referring to, is that precisely by using the word constellation, it means that she's showing us that the testimony of these non-archivable pieces make no evidence for a desire to build a state, but they also make no evidence for any desire for redemption on earth or any step towards a messianic utopian future that would be, even though this messianic future would be always pending, if you will. Each struggle is a moment of an interrupted history, and as Kateb Yassine used to say, if at some point the struggle began, it means that it will never end, which is something he said about a very important figure called Amer Abdul Qadir. Struggles, therefore, this would be my hypothesis, are like stops of a path without progress, but stops here refers to something untranslatable, which is mawaqif. Maybe I'll explain what it means, but it's like a threshold in a sort of path that I refuse to call mystical for reasons that I might explain. Here, the Halaqa joins another word that also means circle, which is the Halaqa, rejoins another word, if you will, that's called daira, which means the geometric circle, the mystical circle, which in fact brings us back to the point as this sort of a spatial entity that brings us actually out of the physical and of anything that's representable. But also daira referred to the 4 circles that made up the first collective that fought against the French invasion, which was called the Smala, and was actually launched by Amer Abdul Qadir, who wrote Kitab al-Mawaqif, that is to say, the book of these stops. The circle, therefore, is not the figure of perfection or eternal movement here. And to make sense of it, one might refer to the intrusion of one insect in Nejma, who's l'araignée. How do you call that in English? Spider. The spider of time, or the spider of history, comes and then leaves as soon as it's noticed by the person who imprisoned Lakhdar, who died, who was or is, because you don't know what's before and after the so-called corpse in the circle. I think I should think about stopping, huh? About a mawqif precisely. Since it never stops, I can stop. That's the thing. That's the conclusion, of course. Okay, let me just say one last thing. I'll really try to be short, I promise. About the reason why I'm doing this, which might seem a bit weird. The reason why I'm doing this is because I'm trying to bypass French theory. I was trying to think about the most simple way of putting it, right? French, but also, if you will, the canonical texts of Francophone theory. And of course, you might say, well, it's just Francophone. But the problem is that most of what we call the humanities here, in this country, but also beyond, are indebted to certain conceptual apparatuses that stem from this moment I was talking about. But these are the actors that people never see when they quote Derrida, Deleuze, Rancière, whoever. So if we want to understand a book like The Wretched of the Earth or Actually, you know that a dying colonialism is not a dying colonialism, it's l'enceinte de la révolution algérienne. And Anglophone readers don't know this title, Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. So to make this work, to unearth these unarchivable events, is precisely one of the preconditions to not reform, but revolutionize, potentially, hopefully, our so-called canon. Thank you.